All right, Alexander, let's do an update as to what's going on in Ukraine, of course. And let's start with we have a lot of news to get to. But let's start with what's going on the ground. I think that's a good starting point. And once again, the fighting is taking place in the east. The Western mainstream media absolutely sucks because all they do is report on what's going on in Kiev pretty much. They touch a little bit on Kharkov, a little bit on Mariupol, just a touch. I mean, they just touch upon it. But, all they talk about is Kiev. And I have to be quite honest. Everything that I'm getting, all the info that I'm getting with regards to Kiev is, I don't want to say nothing's going on, but it's pretty it's not much action is really taking place inside the city. There's the encirclement happening and the cauldron, if you call it that. But inside the city, there is really not much going on outside of gangs, which were giving guns
Yeah,
by Zelensky,
yeah,
kind of duking
yeah,
it out in order to
yeah.
gain control of various territories. In other words, criminal gangs are fighting. Those are my sources. That's what I'm getting. The real action, the real big story is obviously Donbass and the
Yeah,
cauldron, which has now been split, from what I understand, into two
yeah,
cauldrons.
yeah,
60,000 to 80,000 Ukraine military,
yeah,
including a lot of Azov guys,
yeah,
are in those cauldrons. They're trying to retreat, but no luck. They're having no
no,
luck retreating. They're
no,
completely cut off. And then you have the big fighting in Mariupol. And once again, everything that I'm seeing is
yeah,
the the militaries there, the Russian military, the Donetsk, Lugansk militia, and
yeah,
the Chechens are in the city center and they are mopping it up. And sources from Chechnya are making statements saying that by the end of the week, Mariupol will be cleaned up of these Azov guys, the best fighters, by the way, the best
yeah.
fighters that the
Ukraine
Ukraine
has.
military has
Exactly.
are stuck in Mariupol, and they're going to be cleaned up, liquidated, or they're going to have to surrender, whichever comes first. Anyway, that's the information that I'm getting. What are you getting?
I'm getting exactly the same information, but can I also explain to our viewers that we do not work together to research things. We research things separately. So, to a certain extent, and I don't want to overstate this, Alex comes up with his picture. I come up with his picture. We may not be looking, for all I know, at the same sources, but we are ultimately coming to the same conclusions. And I think it's inevitable. I mean, it's clear that the major fight is in Donbass, in the areas around Donbass. I'm going to add one little addition to the points that Alex made. I completely confirm all the information from my sources. When I say my sources, I want to stress these are open sources. I don't have, I don't have people on the ground. I don't, I'm not having the general staff of the Ukrainian or Russian
Yeah,
militaries
same.
phoning me and giving me updates. I don't have anything, these are entirely open sources that I can rely on. But, when one looks around and sees what one can, everything that I'm being told about this is obviously Mariupol is indeed within days, perhaps hours. I'm not going to try and give timelines. I don't have that knowledge of finally being cleared or falling, whichever you prefer. But that battle is almost concluded, and that's important because Mariupol is a key defense point of the Ukrainian military. And the same thing is happening elsewhere, further north in Donbass. That there was there's a major encirclement of a large Ukrainian grouping around a town called Severodonetsk, and that the rest of the Ukrainian military in Donbass is also involved in what you might call a larger strategic encirclement. But I'm just going to add one particular point, which is this, that apparently yesterday, that's to say the 16th of March, the Ukrainians apparently announced that they were going to go on the offensive, that they were going to launch a counteroffensive. And nothing seems very much to have happened. In fact, their counteroffensive seems to have basically, I mean, it didn't so much fail as to get even started. But what I understand is that, yes, there are Ukrainian forces trying to retreat in one or two places. But very extraordinarily and very remarkably, and I want to stress these are open sources, and I can't verify this. What's actually happening is that instead of Ukraine trying to pull its forces back out of Donbass in a sort of organized way, or at least those forces that are not yet trapped, trying to pull them out of Donbass, perhaps bringing them to Kiev to sort of reinforce the defenses there, or something of that kind. I'm not a military person, so strategy isn't me, but doing something of that nature. Apparently, they are trying to send reinforcements and supplies to the troops in Donbass in order, presumably, to try and to hold on there. Now, that seems to me very, very strange. As I said, I'm not a military strategist, but that looks to me like reinforcing failure. It seems to me that you're sending more of your people into what is increasingly looking like a trap. And it doesn't make any kind of sense to me. And I wonder whether this rearrangement of generals that took place just a day or so ago, when the general in overall charge of Donbass was transferred to command in Kiev and another person was put in to take his place, may be a sign of dissension within the Ukrainian leadership about this particular strategy. And if it is indeed the case that these offensives are being attempted, which aren't achieving anything, that reinforcements are being sent to the east instead of people being pulled back out of the east, I'm going to suggest that the reason for that is connected to the ongoing negotiations, which is that Ukraine has very grudgingly been pushed to facing neutrality, accepting some kind of neutrality, but that it doesn't want to completely pull out of Donbass. The political leadership wants to keep some kind of military presence in Donbass, because if Donbass is completely cleared, if the Lugansk and Donetsk regions are completely cleared, that will weaken Ukraine's position in negotiations where the Russians are demanding that Ukraine recognize their independence, the independence of these territories within the regions, the original Soviet-drawn regions of the Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts. Now, if that is so, and I'm piling on speculation on top of speculation, but I think all of these ideas are reasonable, and they are based on, as I said, reports from the ground. Then, as I said, it suggests that this is becoming a war in which the leadership of the Ukrainian government in Kiev is no longer considering military realities, is entirely tied to political ones. And of course, all that will do, in my opinion, is it will make the defeat in eastern Ukraine even more massive than it would have been otherwise. So it's an example of what happens when amateur politicals take over the conduct of military operations. So that's all I think I can add to the points that you can make, and I hope I've made it clear what part of it is my speculations, if you like, my assessments, as opposed to, actual factual information about what's going on the ground. But indisputably, Mariupol, close to falling now. As you correctly said, the Russians, the Chechens, the DPR people are in the center of the city. Apparently, Ukrainian resistance there is starting to crumble. An encirclement of Ukrainian troops further north around a place called Severodonetsk, and a larger strategic cauldron being created with the Russians encircling the larger Ukrainian army, based incidentally around two towns, Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, which were very much center of the fighting back in 2014. So that seems to me indisputable. And as I said, some very strange decisions by the Ukrainians, if my assessments are correct.
Well, it's strange if you are the Ukrainian leadership that's actually making decisions, but it's not the Ukrainian leadership that is actually making decisions. It's people from the outside that are making decisions
Well,
for them.
indeed,
So they don't
it's,
really care
yeah,
about the well-being of the Ukraine people or the Ukraine military
yes,
whatsoever. Their goal is exactly as you said. Their goal is to make sure that they have some sort of presence, military
yes,
presence in the East as the negotiations are taking place, because the political class that is making the decisions for the
yes,
puppet Zelensky, who is a puppet,
yes,
and they are puppeteering Zelensky.
yes,
They're the ones that are saying, no, you are going to send military into those areas. We don't care what happens to them, because as you negotiate, we know that whatever the Russians take over and whatever they clear of any military presence, those lands, they're not going to give it back. They understand that, and that's what we're seeing. Whatever the Russians are getting, they're removing the flags,
yes,
putting the Russian flags on there. They're
yes,
clearing the
yes,
cities out,
yes,
and they're taking them over. And so there's
yes,
an understanding from the people that are puppeteering Zelensky.
yes,
Move military there. We don't care what happens to them. But as these negotiations try to find some sort of conclusion, we want to make sure we have boots on the ground in
yes,
those areas so that
yes,
we can have some sort of leverage. What's going on in Kiev could change, because we do have statements from Peskov, who has said that yes, Vladimir Putin has given an order not to enter the major cities. We have
yes,
confirmation of that. But
yes,
Peskov also threw a caveat in there, and he said that could change at any time. And this is a good segue into Zelensky's speech to Congress. The issue that I have there, the fear that I have, is that Russia is faced with an interesting predicament. They don't want to enter these large cities for the reasons of incurring civilian casualties. They don't want that. They don't want to destroy infrastructure. They don't want to flatten these cities, but they do want to capture these cities
yes,
or push these cities so that they reach some sort of diplomatic solution in accordance with what the demands of the Kremlin are.
yes,
But the longer this drags out, the harder it's going to get for the Russians to achieve that in this soft tiptoeing kind of manner, because on the American side, what you have after Zelensky's speech is the Americans saying, let's pump more weapons
yes,
into Ukraine
yes,
and let's try to keep
yes,
this going. In other words,
yeah,
the Americans want the Russians to flatten these cities, because the narrative for 3 weeks has been that the Russians have flattened Kiev, and they
yes,
haven't.
and
And those
no,
pictures and those videos and those photos are starting to come out. And people are starting to say, wait a minute, you've been telling me for 3 weeks that the Russians have completely flattened the city like we flattened Fallujah or whatever,
Fallujah,
right?
exactly, yeah,
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, and it hasn't happened. And now these videos are starting to get out there. So they want the Russians to enter these cities and flatten them. This is like a race against time in a way. And I don't know what
yes,
the Russian military and what the Kremlin is going to do, because they have to find a solution quickly. Otherwise, I
yeah,
fear they're not going to have much of a choice, because
yeah,
the more this drags on, the more you're
yeah,
hearing no-fly zones, the more you're hearing World War III, the
yes,
more you're hearing nuclear
yes, yes,
war, false
yes,
flags. All these things become a higher probability. So they have to do something. And by the way, on Zelensky's speech, it was the puppet speaking to the puppet masters. Very bizarre. A terrible speech.
yeah,
It was
just,
completely scripted, not by
yes,
Zelensky. Zelensky
no,
didn't write any of that. Zelensky
no,
has no idea who MLK is. He has no idea what I Have a Dream is. He has no idea about Pearl Harbor, 9/11. Maybe he knows a little bit about 9/11, maybe. And that video that they played to get people to cry in Congress was a very slick, highly produced video, straight out, in my opinion, straight out of Hollywood or some DC think tank.
yeah,
The whole thing is complete theatrics. But
yes,
no fly zone. At least the rhetoric now, Alexander, is not no fly zone. Let's build a Ukraine no
yeah,
fly zone. That's what they're saying. Let's
I know,
help
I know,
Ukraine create a no fly zone.
I know.
It's madness.
Yes, I know. It's complete madness, and it's also absurd, actually. Can I say, I mean, I found the whole speech and the address to Congress, to be straightforward about it, surreal. It did look like a movie. It did look like a movie scene. And I have to say, because of that, I found the whole thing had weird sense of unreality about it. And I can't imagine the people in Ukraine, if anybody in Ukraine is watching, that they would have been at all impressed. It was a very, very strange speech. And by the way, I agree. I think most of it was written for Zelensky, probably by Americans. I mean, I'm guessing, but that is precisely what I think.
I have a dream. I have a dream, really.
I know. Yeah.
I mean,
I know. I mean, this isn't. I mean, exactly. I mean, it's too remote from Ukrainian realities to be a Ukrainian speech. To say it straightforwardly. As that. And by the way, he's also now made a speech to the Bundestag in Germany, which again looked to me to be heavily scripted, essentially by the same people. But you're absolutely right. They're now sending more weapon systems to Ukraine, more anti-tank systems, more Stinger anti-aircraft systems, and of course these kamikaze drones. What I've understood, and again, I'm not a military person, is that in and of themselves, these weapon systems that Biden has said they're sending to Ukraine are not going to make any significant difference to the battle. I mean, they're not the kind of systems that would make a really big difference, except in one respect, and that is if there was an attack on the cities. If you have anti-tank systems in the cities, then they can be very useful in street fighting, apparently. But that, of course, always assumes that your people in the cities that are, in fact, up to fighting in that kind of way. But that plays directly into your point about trying to create enormous battles in the cities, thousands of casualties, tens of thousands of casualties, increase the temperature even further. I don't know what the Russian strategy is. I think that the Russian strategy remains, to the extent that it can be, to drain the cities and encircle them, prevent weapon systems like the ones we've just been talking about from reaching those cities, and gradually, step by step, inch ever closer in. I'm also going to make a guess, and this is, I'm not a military person, I just want to reiterate, that if the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine is destroyed, which is looking increasingly as if that's going to happen and happen fairly soon, then I really do wonder whether the fight will go out of this, to be straightforward about it, because without your army, how do you continue the battle? That may be the Russian strategy. At the moment, the overall impression I get is that the Russians are watching all of these events, but they're not being panicked or thrown off course by them. Now, that may change. They may adjust their strategies at any time, but that's how it looks to me at the moment.
it is. It's so reckless to pour all these weapons into Ukraine or just to Europe. You know what's going to happen? A lot of these weapons, maybe some will get in. A lot of them are going to cause chaos in the cities if they do get in. A lot of Ukrainians, innocent Ukrainians, and military are going to die.
Yeah.
Needlessly. There's no need for this to happen. But you're also going to get a lot of weapons entering Poland. They're going to enter Ukraine, but they're going to go right to the black market. They're going to end up in the hands of NAZIs and jihadists. And a lot of these weapons are anti-aircraft weapons, anti-aircraft missiles, stingers and stuff like that, manpads and stuff like that. These are things that if you are in Europe, they could bring down once again. You're talking about commercial airliners and stuff like that. This is such a bad idea. It is such a bad idea. Long term, looking past this conflict, this is such a bad idea.
I completely agree.
Where is Europe on this? Where is Europe?
Well, indeed. I think this is an utterly reckless and irresponsible idea. I think pouring manpads on this scale into a conflict like this is utterly reckless. It's mad. And it's going to create massive security problems in Europe. And I am utterly cynical about the where these weapons are going to end up. I'm sure lots of them are going to end up in the hands of all sorts of dangerous people. And I think this is absolutely reckless and foolish. But I'm afraid we are on a ladder of escalation. And I think that we are seeing how the situation is increasingly getting out of control. The best thing that could happen, the right strategy at this point in time, is not to pour arms into Ukraine, especially arms like this. It is to try and help the parties to a negotiated solution. The outlines of it now are there. Ukraine has accepted it's not joining NATO. I mean, it would have been very good if that had been accepted 5 weeks ago. We wouldn't have had a war in that case. But anyway, it's accepted that it won't join NATO. So given that that was the big prize, getting Ukraine into NATO, and given that that's been abandoned, why not try and find a negotiated solution on all the other issues, on demilitarization, on the status of Donbass, Crimea, and all the other places, on the fundamental political structures of Ukraine, a negotiated solution, by the way, which has been possible ever since the Minsk agreement was concluded back in February 2015. Why not focus on that rather than pour in weapon systems, which are not going to they're not going to change the outcome, but they are going to lead to an ever more dangerous cycle of fighting. They will risk drawing the European members of NATO in exactly the way that you said. And of course, they will lead to many, many more people being killed, far more devastation being done, and ultimately the destruction of Ukraine. And that's the minimum of what they might do.
Yeah, because this is not about helping Ukraine. This is not about finding a solution for Ukraine. This is some sick fetish to cause regime change in Russia, to destroy Russia, to make Europe subordinate forever to these deep state U.S. Globalists. Maybe this is even just about increasing the pace of the Great Reset. I don't know, but it's definitely not about putting an end to this conflict or helping Ukraine have a better future. That's not what this is about at all, which leads us to Vladimir Putin's speech. While Zelensky was giving his performance, and that's what it was, a performance in front of Congress, Vladimir Putin was giving a speech to the Russian people. And this was very much a speech where Vladimir Putin told the people of Russia, we are out of the Western system. It's not a good system. We had no choice, even though we tried to negotiate. We tried to send our warnings. At the end of the day, Ukraine, from our intelligence, this is what Putin was saying, from our side of things, we saw Ukraine was trying to get nukes. We saw they had bioweapons. They were trying to develop those. And we told them countless times, please retreat your army from the east. Retreat your army from the east. And according to Putin, the Ukraine side said, no, we're not going to retreat our army. As a matter of fact, we're going to prepare an attack. We're going to go on the offensive. This is what Putin told the Russian people. He also talked a lot about the economics of the situation, the financial situation. And basically it was Putin saying, you know what? We want none of globalism. We're out of it. We want none of the West. We're out of it. Entrepreneurs, bring your money home. Investors, Russian investors, bring your money back home. We're not going to seize assets from companies as well because we don't steal. I mean, he said all these things in what I think was a historic declaration of, I don't want to say declaration of war, but it was against the globalization against the globalists. It was a declaration of something towards the globalists. I can't find the words, but he was saying we're out. We're out, and these are the reasons why, and this is why the war happened.
Yes. I thought it was the most important speech of his political career. I mean, it depends, obviously, whether or not he wins the war, which I'm confident he will, and what happens to Russia, and we'll come to that in a moment. But assuming that he wins the war, which I'm confident he will, and assuming Russia remains intact, which I'm also confident it will, then, as I said, this will be the single most important speech Putin has given in all the 20 plus years that he's been the country's leader, and who knows how much longer he'll continue to be its leader. I mean, this was an extraordinary speech. It was an absolutely seminal speech. Now, let's begin by talking about the military things. One of the things that really struck me is that from what I was able to understand from the speech, the talk about withdrawing, the advice given to the Ukrainians to withdraw their army from Donbass was given even as the operation, the Russian attack, was being launched. They were trying to get the Ukrainians to pull back. I mean, they continued even after, apparently, as far as I can make out. Even after that, they've been trying to get the Ukrainians to pull their forces back. And there's been, on the contrary, and as I discussed earlier in the program, there's been this rejection of this from the Ukrainians. So that is the operational side. And as you correctly said, he went over the history with the problems with Ukraine, the fact that the Minsk agreement was never implemented, the fact that negotiations went nowhere, the fact that the fighting in the Donbass never ceased. So he went over all that ground, which of course he's gone over before. But I thought even more interesting, actually, was what he had to say about the general global situation. I mean, he made it absolutely clear that what he sees, I think this is also what a lot of Russians see, is that all of this is part of a final throw, if you like, by the Western powers to break Russia, to bring it back into a kind of subordinate position like it was in the 1990s, and that they're throwing everything at it. So firstly, there was the attempt to destabilize the Russian financial system through the shock and awe tactic of, freezing the central bank's reserves, sanctioning the central bank, de-swifting companies, all of that, creating a financial breakdown. And as he's, I think, rightly said, that failed. That attempt did not succeed. So the next stage was getting all these Western companies to pull out of Russia, to stop them supplying goods and services to Russians, to create supply shortages. And he seemed extremely confident that the Russians will be able to respond to that too. And he accepted that there would be some inflation, because obviously you can't just replace goods and services immediately, and some unemployment. But he seemed confident overall that he would be able to cope with it, and Russia would be able to cope with it. And importantly, he said that there is no shortage of capital, no shortage of funds in Russia. They have all the funds they need to sustain their development programs. They won't need to resort to money printing. They won't need to do any of those things because their financial system is stable and liquid, and that there's no risk of everything seizing up. So it was a very, very confident speech, but at the same time, it was a speech that highlighted the fact that there is an overall attack on Russia, an economic attack in the form that we've discussed with sanctions, an attempt to break Russia that way. But he also talked about, and this is something he's never done before, he talked about a fifth column, people based outside Russia, living in places like Miami, wanting to be admitted into the gilded circles of the Western elite, and people from there trying to influence political events in Russia in what they believe to be their own interests. And he spoke about a consolidation, a cleansing of Russian society as these people, the leftovers, if you like, from the 90s, are finally purged and cleansed out of it. It was quite an unusual departure for him. He's never spoken in that way. I don't think he's ever used the expression fifth column before, but he did in this case. And last but not least, something that I found very interesting is that there was no retreat from the free market, the market solutions that Russia has introduced into its own economy over the last 30, 20, especially 30 years, but especially the last 20 years since he was president. So private property rights will continue to be respected. There will be no return to overall price controls. We may see, in fact, we will see an awful lot more planning. We've already, of course, got capital controls, but there's no return to anything that remotely resembles the Soviet economic system as it existed before the reforms began in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. So it was quite an extraordinary speech in some ways, but it clearly said these people in the West, they are our enemies. They're launching an attack on us. They orchestrated these events in Ukraine. The sanctions that they launched against us were intended to break us. They won't succeed. We have the resources to deal with all of these things. We have our friends around the world, of which we've seen more and more evidence, by the way, with the stance that China and India and Brazil is now taking. Apparently Brazil has even been floating the idea of getting Russian expertise to help it build nuclear submarines, which is quite an astonishing revelation. But anyway, they don't feel isolated in that kind of way. They will see this challenge off. They will break the fifth column that exists in Russia and which is supported by these people who live abroad. And at the end of it, the globalization process, certainly insofar as it applies to Russia, will be once and truly and forever ended. So it was quite an extraordinary speech. It was the moment, in my opinion, when the moment of no return. There is, up to now, Putin has been prepared to work or trying to work with the West. He's decided that it is impossible. I think when I say Putin, I mean the entire Russian political elite and much of its business elite as well, by the way, and its scientific and industrial and military things and the critical mass of the Russian population. They've said enough's enough. We're going to go our own way. We have the means, we have the tools, we have the money, we have our friends, and that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, they're out.
They're out.
Putin basically said that we're out of the system. And yeah, they are our enemies, he said. And he also made a interesting point about, he talked about the fact that the West can't be trusted on a financial level, given what happened with the central bank and the confiscation of Russian assets and reserves. And, he kind of compared that to how Russia is acting, in that Russia can be trusted because his point was, we're not going to seize private property. We're not going to seize the property of these companies and just take these companies' assets, because his point was, we don't act like that. I mean, he created this picture of how the West acts, the financial system of the West, and how the financial system of this new system, this new architecture is going to act. And there's no doubt about it that, when you're talking about this new architecture, you're talking about China for sure, and possibly India, possibly Iran, possibly Brazil, possibly Turkey. Who knows?
Who knows? Yes. But
Africa, Saudi Arabia, even to a little bit. I mean, who knows where this is going to go?
Who knows? I entirely agree. And can I just make one very interesting observation? And this goes back to our discussion some time ago with Tom Longo, which is that, it seems to me that what the Russians are doing is that they're recreating, they're reconfiguring their financial architecture. They're building up their gold-backed ruble internally, but I think what they're coming very close to saying, or at least what they're sort of hinting at, is that, eventually, if you're a rich person and you want to park your money somewhere, park it in Russia. You might be an Argentine or a Brazilian or a Yemeni or a Saudi, a Yemeni, who knows, a Malaysian. But, we respect private property rights. We are going to have a stable financial system. We have an economy which is massively backed by commodities. We're going to be linked to all the big industrial chains. There's much talk about, accelerating development of the Russian aircraft industries, for example. All kinds of things of that kind. So, we are a more attractive and safe destination for you going forward than the City of London and New York is. Now, that's quite an extreme thing to say, actually. We'll see whether it works, but that does seem to me to flag up that possibility that at the back of Putin's mind, and maybe of other people in Moscow, that is the ultimate objective.
Yeah, but given what's happened to someone like Abramovich, for example, you start to
Absolutely.
wonder, is it safe to keep my money in the City of London?
Well, indeed, absolutely, yes. Well, I know, indeed. And, what did Abramovich do? What did Abramovich do in relation to Ukraine? I mean, it's a, the thing about Abramovich, just to mention this, I mean, there have been all sorts of books, articles, claims from all sorts of people linking him to Putin, attempting to make out that he's involved in some sort of dark and nefarious activities. And he's brought court case after court case in the British courts. And he's either won them, as he famously did against Boris Berezovsky, or alternatively, he settled them very much on his terms. And yet, what we see is all that legal process, as far as he's concerned, has achieved nothing, because the British government just goes ahead and sanctions him. So they take his property, they take his football club, they accuse him of every conceivable sin under the sun. There's now moves apparently against Yevgeny Lebedev, who owns the Evening Standard, who has absolutely no connection to Putin whatsoever. So there's all these moves being made against all of these people, even though nothing has ever been proved against them in any court of law in Britain. Due process, well, whatever became of that?
Yeah, well, this is boomeranging. It's going to boomerang back to
Now,
the City of
Gonzalo
London and to all these
Lira,
financial.
indeed, Gonzalo Lira, our very good friend, suggested that at some point, maybe not immediately, maybe not within the next few years, but at some point, the Russians might start asking for payment for their oil, gas, food, all the rest of them in rubles. Now, if that ever does happen, and, in a ruble system linked to the bigger RMB system, then I can, in fact, start to see that investing your money in Russia, putting your money there, might become, for some people, an attractive proposition. So maybe that's the plan.
Because it has the commodities. Real quick, two quick things, and we'll wrap up this video. A quote from Lukashenko, the president of Belarus. Quote, "If Kiev does not sign an agreement with Moscow, then they will have to sign an act of surrender." End quote. And a quote from Joe Biden after the Zelensky performance, which was, "Is Vladimir Putin a war criminal?" And at first he was like, no, no, no. And then he circled back around to the reporter and said, "Oh yes, he is a war criminal."
Yeah, it's like the Putin is a killer thing last year. it's Biden, in my opinion, letting slip what he really wants to say. I pay no attention to what Biden says, to be honest. But what Lukashenko says is absolutely to be taken seriously. And
all right.
Well, I don't think.
Yeah.
I just repeat again. I don't think the Ukrainians have as much time as maybe they hope to have. And if they are indeed sending men and supplies to eastern Ukraine to try and cling on there in the hope that that will strengthen their position in negotiations, that's a foolish idea. It will do the opposite. So better that they come to terms fast now. Otherwise, what Lukashenko said is what's going to happen.
Yeah, well, the Russian military of the Ministry of Defense is saying that they have more information on the biolabs, that they're going to release more information on these things. I think they have a lot of information on a lot of things,
I'm sure they do.
from Burisma to these biolabs, that they don't have anything to lose at this moment in time. So I wouldn't be surprised if they release it all over time.
I wouldn't be.
They're not going to throw it all out there. They're going to release it over the many, many months and years. But they did say that they have that information. They're also very worried about a false flag, as everyone is, because we're seeing more and more signs that Zelensky is trying, the Zelensky regime, these people in and around Zelensky and behind Zelensky are orchestrating various false flags in and around Mariupol for now, but that it could easily be in and around Kiev in the future as well. So there is that fear that is going around.
It's a very real fear. We discussed this before, and I talked about it in my live stream on Locals yesterday. The point is that to the extent that Ukraine has a strategy, it is to try to get the West directly involved in the war. And how do you do that? You have to have a big incident that you can, get the media to talk up so as to provoke enough outrage to overwhelm the voices of reason that say, you mustn't get involved. So that the possibility of some incident being staged, for me, is extremely real.
That's why time is critical as well.
Yeah,
all right.
I agree.
We'll leave it there. The Duran.locals.com. Everybody, on the top of the screen, if you're watching this from Rumble, you will see on the top of the page a red maroon button, which will take you to our Locals community, directly to our Locals community. Just click on that button and go to the Duran shop. 10% off when you use the code GOODDAY. 10% off all our merch. There's the Good Day mug. Take care.